Hi, everyone. Good Friday to you. Welcome to today's Ethnic Media Services weekly national news briefing. I'm Pilar Marrero, your moderator for today's briefing. In 2022, the Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank, released a document called Project 2025. It aims to promote extreme policies, reshape the United States federal government, and consolidate executive power over the presidency if its preferred candidate wins the election. Experts describe Project 2025 as an ideological agenda designed to push the US toward autocracy. Legal experts warn that it would erode the rule of law, weaken the separation of powers, blur the lines between church and state, and threaten civil liberties. But what are the implications of the proposed policies in Project 2025 for immigrant rights, reproductive rights, and LGBTQIA plus rights? Policy leaders and advocates in these fields would discuss the topic and draw on an analysis recently released by the AAPI Equity Alliance. Our speakers today are Manju Kulkarni, Executive Director of AAPI Equity Alliance, Sulma Arias, Executive Director of the People's Action Institute and People's Action, Yvonne Gutierrez, Chief Strategy Officer of Reproductive Freedom for All, and Tony Huang, Executive Director of Equality California. We will send the video of today's briefing along with expanded bios for each speaker later today. We will also send video excerpts of the presentations early next week. So let's go right into it. We begin with Manjusha Kulkarni, Executive Director of AAPI Equity Alliance. Manju, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Pilar. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. My name again is Manju Kulkarni. I'm Executive Director of AAPI Equity Alliance. We're a coalition of nearly 50 community-based organizations that together serve and represent the 1.6 million Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in Los Angeles County. I'm here today in my 501c3 capacity, sharing with you our analysis. But first, I want to thank Ethnic Media Services for organizing this press briefing, along with our partners at Equality California, Reproductive Freedom for All, and the People's Action and People's Action Institute. So let me start by talking about why we're here today. In 2020, AAPI Equity Alliance, together with Chinese for Affirmative Action and San Francisco State University, co-founded Stop AAPI Hate, the nation's leading reporting center that tracks reports of anti-Asian hate that's directed at individuals from our community. We recently released a report called From Pain to Power, looking at recent incidents of hate. We know that it's less about COVID-19 related racism, and now in 2023 and 2024, more about racist rhetoric and xenophobic policies. And we know what hate looks like against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. We know it when we see it. And frankly, Project 2025 is an existential threat to our communities. At Stop AAPI Hate, we read and analyzed all 900 plus pages of Project 2025, a policy document so extreme and unpopular that a majority of Americans, when asked, have said they've heard about it and they're very, very concerned. As Pilar mentioned, 2 years ago, the Heritage Foundation described it as an opening salvo for the 2025 transition. So they themselves have placed it where we know that it will be utilized and will be implemented. The document uses every opportunity to demonize immigrant communities using terms like, quote, illegal aliens, infiltrate, and committing crimes. all of these serve to fan the flames of racism. And we know that this isn't in a vacuum because we've seen it most recently in Springfield, Ohio, where false claims were made about Haitian immigrants, saying that they had stolen pets and were eating them. That is not dissimilar from what our AAPI communities have faced for decades. We know from the reports we've gotten, for example, one restaurateur in the Bay Area had to close his restaurant because there was on Yelp accusations that he was serving dog meat. So this is something that these feelings, the reactions that we have gotten from anti-immigrant racist is something we know all too well. So I'm going to focus my remarks on really the most dangerous proposals in Project 2025 and as they relate to immigration. Again, an issue that hits close to home for many of us. A majority of AAPIs are immigrants or children of immigrants. I myself am an immigrant. I came with my parents when I was 2 after the passage of the Immigration Act of 1965 that really was came to fruition because of Black civil rights leaders. And so I know what this means to my community, to my family, to my friends. And Project 2025 envisions a mass deportation force unlike anything we've ever seen. It would give broad authority to immigration agents at ICE to target, arrest, detain, and deport immigrants, including Asian immigrants, from across the country, including right here in Los Angeles. Immigrant agents could claim the right to enter our private homes, schools, places of business, and even houses of worship. So let's be clear about what this means. It means federal agents going door to door to search for undocumented immigrants without a warrant from a judge and arresting people who they suspect to be undocumented. So we know that when officers suspect folks, that often means just simply because of the color of our skin. That means that it is suspicion that is not necessarily based on actual immigration status. And we know that this also impacts millions of mixed status families in our country, households with undocumented parents whose children are US citizens. So what will ICE agents do? Will they be separating parents from their children? Will these children be put into foster care? And what if ICE gets it wrong? Something that we know that they sadly routinely do, even to US citizens or immigrants with legal status. So this is just one of the many extremist proposals in the document. Project 2025 could also imperil dreamers who are able to build their lives here without fear, thanks to the DACA program. Right now, more than 14,000 AAPIs can remain and work in the US thanks to DACA. If that is eliminated, those people who came here as children could face deportation back to countries they often have no connection to. And what happens to families, to friends, and communities? Let's remember that for every person Project 2025 seeks to deport, that there are many, many others who would be devastated by these policies and these actions. Project 2025 would eliminate family-based immigration, which really has been a key tool for thousands of families being able to reunite in the United States, including my very own. It would downsize the H-1B visa program, a majority of which go to Asian immigrants, especially those from India, which is my birthplace, who are among those, some of the brightest minds in science, technology, innovation, and more. And there's also been discussion of denaturalizing US citizens and even removing birthright citizenship. by those who are running for office. So the danger of Project 2025 is real. And while we still cannot believe that they would actually put all of this down in writing, I'm frankly glad that they did, so that all of us can see what they have planned, because now we are informed about this extremist agenda. We can inform our communities and we can take steps to protect ourselves. So I want to encourage everyone watching and listening to visit our website, read the entirety of our analysis. Trust me, it's not 900 pages. We read it all, so you don't have to. Please share it widely, because Project 2025, again, is an existential threat. Again, I want to share that we just released our report. It's on the Stop AAPI Hate website, From Pain to Power. And we have a South Asian briefing this coming Wednesday on the 9th at 11 a.m. It's a press briefing about the specific impact on South Asian Americans. So I want to thank you again to EMS, to our staff at Stop AAPI Hate and AAPI Equity Alliance, and especially to Candace Wong, who did that analysis along with others, and Tina and Jess, and to Nakatomi and Associates, who've been so extremely helpful in putting together our materials and being able to share them. So thank you so much, Pilar, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Manju. That was very informative. I'm going to start with the last question that came in because I think it's very intriguing. Don Tagala, do you want to ask your question?
Yes. Hi, I'm Don Tagala, ABS-CBN News. So I don't know how many times former President Trump attempted to distance himself from this Project 25, but he has so many ties to it, from the people who made it. So is this specific to Trump? If he wins the presidency, then it will be implemented no matter what? Or in the future, if it's another Republican White House, are they still going to implement it?
That's a great question. Thank you so much for that, Don. A couple things, I would say because it says Project 2025, right? There was a plan to implement this as soon as possible and in a GOP administration. Now, I understand that former President Trump has tried to distance himself, and yet at the same time, he has evoked many parts of it. So he says, I haven't read it, but the pieces of this and this and this are great. Well, if you haven't read it, how would you know that they're great, right? You know what it is, you've stood behind it. And, with many things, when candidates find that they're unpopular with the American electorate, they do try to distance themselves. Unfortunately, I can't speak to whether this might take hold in a future GOP president. But what I can say is that this is something supported by a number of local, state, and federal officials. So it's not unique to the presidential candidate. And so I think it's really, really important for that reason that we are aware of it, informed, and that we take action as advocates, as community leaders, as media, to protect ourselves and our communities. Because while former President Trump may have tried to distance himself, he also has said it will be bloody. This is a quote. And he said that they will be ripping mothers apart from children. He said it'll be really sad, but we'll have to take moms away from their kids. So, you can check that out for yourself. It absolutely sounds like Project 2025, whether it has the name or not. So this is the plan going forward, and we should be clear-eyed when we think about it.
Andrew, when Mr. Trump ran in 2016, he said he was going to build a wall and have Mexico pay for it. Of course, yeah, he built a few miles. Didn't have Mexico pay for it. Some people have told me that's just writing. He's not going to do any of this. How do we know it is a real threat? How do you know?
Well, I know because of two things. One, he has said he's going to do it. Two is because he did many of those things or tried to do many of those things in the past, right? We should not forget that thousands of children were separated from their parents. They were put in detention camps. Children were put in as small as young as 1 year old. Children, babies in diapers were put into detention facilities. So we know that that they will do it again. They're interested in doing it again. They're using that language. And let me say the last thing, it was not limited to just family separation. There was also the Muslim ban. There were other efforts, right, to bring in fear, have policies that demonize our communities, and prevent us from being in the US. There's even been talk of self-deportation, which means that they want to scare us so much that we will leave on our own because they don't want brown and black and Asian folks in the US. And that's really, I think, what the bottom line is.
Got you. Well, thank you so much. We're going to move on to the next speaker. And that is Zulma Arias, Executive Director of People's Actions Institute and People's Action. Zulma, please go ahead.
Thank you, Pilar. It's great to be here, and thanks everyone for creating space for such an important conversation. Again, Zulma Arias, I lead a national organization called People's Action. And for us in this election, our goal is to talk to almost 500,000 conflicted voters or undecided voters. So we work with tens of thousands of people, volunteers, and our partners in states, but especially the conversations are happening in states like Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Arizona, where we have conflicted voters, especially in rural areas. A lot of the times, the conversations that we're having with undecided voters and conflicted voters are around the things that are in line with our values. And one of the things I want to, because I make those calls and have been having these conversations myself, is that all across the board, but especially in Latino communities, there is hardly any education or conversation about Project 2025. And you know, it's just, to me, especially maybe even 5 or 6 months ago, there was nothing in Spanish on the danger, or even, you know, what's a summary of the 900 some pages on Project 2025. So we do talk to voters about our hopes, our fears, and we talk to them about Project 2025 and what's there. And we already, you know, I think the only thing I'm going to add to what's already been said, both Pilar have both of you have talked, and so I'm not going to add to that, but I am going to say one thing. It is a collection of ideas that have been part of an agenda that has been coming for a long time. So to the question that was asked earlier, think about the corporate interests that are behind the agenda. The Heritage Foundation, which then is a coalition of corporations that would seek to benefit if a lot of those ideas are implemented. So this is not going away. So the more that we talk about it and the more that we understand it, the better prepared we are to organize against it. And it's dangerous because of all the reasons that were described. And on immigration, then the impact that it's going to have, you know, it's already been articulated, but this is what I'm going to add. In 2016, when I was running the Fair Immigration Reform Movement, which is one of the largest networks on immigrant rights. And what I experienced collectively with that community was the fact that, you know, exactly the fear that happens, and we have a long list of actually what they were able to do to intimidate, to separate what's happening. What happened is already dehumanizing. What could happen it's going to be 10 times worse, because what they will attempt to do is to try to implement as much of that as they can. And, I already went through this, in places in Mississippi and Alabama and Tennessee where mass raids happened and people were already in fear. I don't want to go through that again. And I don't think our communities deserve to go through that again. And I definitely think we should take them at their word. But there are other things that are like, in addition to immigration, that because of who we are at People's Action, we work on issues of housing, we work on issues of healthcare, and we work on issues of climate. So we were especially looking at Project 2025 with the lens of, so what happens, what happens to housing, what happens to climate, and what happens to healthcare. And I think when we talk to voters about Project 2025, all of these things come up. So immigration comes up and we're having these conversations, but we're also looking deeply at the impact of the Project 2025, if implemented. Some of those ideas have huge impacts on states like Georgia, Florida, North Carolina, where we already see Hurricane Helene's impact, right? Over 200 people are dead, over 200 million people are without power, and there are $35 billion in damage. And I mean, just sit with that for a minute, because what you're looking at, if Project 2025 were to be implemented, is that it will, first of all, it's in those 900 pages, and if you go to the Stop AAPI Hate website, we'll find the details. We also have the details on the People's Action website, because what it does is it eliminates small businesses, the disaster loans to small businesses. So it raises the threshold for disaster declaration. Project 25 will get rid of the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration. It's the NOAA and the National Weather Service. These are fundamental entities that we need at the moment with what we're seeing. They would be privatized. They would privatize the Weather Service, and it's all laid out there. How they would do it, that is a blueprint. That's a blueprint they would follow. I mean, we also work in our climate program. We also work with people who are experiencing high utility cost. Now, I want you to pay attention and follow the corporate, the who's benefiting and how corporations are benefiting, because what tends to happen is that, we look at this, but who's behind it? Remember who's behind this. And it's an effort to privatize the things that are public, like the need for utilities. So in this moment, what Project 25 would do is utilities are always already too high. So these utility companies who are price gouging ratepayers, or in our communities, we're talking to them. We're talking to them to this process that we call deep canvas conversations, and we hear from voters how their utility bills are up to $300. Sometimes people can barely afford them. But what the Project 2025 would do is actually give more of that power to corporations, like the corporations that are doing the price gouging for some of our communities. So, I mean, it would be disastrous, and there are so many implications right now that we don't have to wait until all of Project 2025 is implemented to see the impact on climate and directly how it impacts our community, because it's already happening. So the trend is already moving in that direction. And if implemented, what Project 2025 would do is actually make it official and make it easier, supercharge it so that happens. For us, we're also looking at healthcare, and we're looking specifically, I mean, communities who are vulnerable, communities of color, and especially Latino communities would be impacted, because if on healthcare, we're gonna start seeing the privatization again of Medicare, the increased cost of the basic things that sometimes could mean life or death for our communities. And I mean, one specific aspect on healthcare is that it gets rid of healthcare protections for people with pre-existing conditions. It allows the government to monitor pregnancies, to potentially prosecute people even in cases of a miscarriage. And if you all remember, one thing that we were able to see about the power of government in regulating corporations around the privatization of healthcare, one positive thing that we were able to see in the Biden-Harris administration is that they were able to negotiate with companies to lower the cost of prescription medicines like insulin. That is huge for people the price of insulin means the difference between life and death. The goal of Project 2025, in essence, is to privatize a lot of the medical cost and privatize it into corporations like United Health. Now, we at People's Action work on a campaign to expose what United Health is doing. And basically what it's doing is that in 1 year, it denied over 250 million cases, while at the same time, they were having record profits for them and for their investors. And all those profits came out of denying people the chance to have an operation, the chance to have a surgery that they might need. So if you look at the trend and what Project 2025 is doing, is that it will seek to privatize even things like Medicare to be run by corporations like United Health, which will mean that they will decide who gets the medical care that we need. That's especially important for Latinas, as we look at Project 2025 and how disproportionately it impacts poor people and people of color, especially.
Can you wrap
Pilar?
up?
Yep.
Can you wrap it up?
Yep. And especially when, we're looking at Latinas age 18 to 64, and 1 in 4 Latinas nationally are covered by Medicare. Just think about the impact of Medicare being privatized into a corporation like United Health. So thank you again. I'm going to wrap it up here and ready if there are any questions.
Thank you, Sulma. Yeah, privatization, that's a very important issue. But on the other hand, we saw a recent report, I think it's the American Immigration Council, saying that the massive deportation will create a deficit of $1 trillion for the United States. How will this help corporations? So it would probably help the government even less than corporations, right? What do you think about that?
Absolutely. And I think there are intersecting interest here, right? Because they haven't thought this through, I don't think, in terms of like how does the economic impact of having it's not only the horror and the separation of families, Pilar, as you well know, but the economic impact that could have in the entire country when we all rely on immigrant labor for some of the basic things that this country needs to stay afloat.
Yeah, something we need to keep an eye on. Thank you so much, Sulma. We're going to move on in the interest of time to Yvonne Gutierrez. She is Chief Strategy Officer for Reproductive Freedom for All. Yvonne?
Yes, thank you, Pilar, and thank you all for joining us today. I'm Yvonne Gutierrez from Reproductive Freedom for All. We are formerly NARAL Pro-Choice America, and we've helped lead the charge for over 50 years in the fight for abortion rights, access to birth control, parental leave policies, and pregnancy protections. So I think you've heard from the previous speakers that I don't need to reiterate just the dire threat that Project 2025 is to our freedoms. This 900-page conservative policy agenda is a blueprint to decimate our fundamental rights and democracy that they could begin launching on day one. Their extensive mandate highlights various proposals that deal with or would directly implicate reproductive freedom, including abortion, medication abortion, emergency abortion care, contraception, and in vitro fertilization, which I know we've all heard a lot about. So throughout this document, Project 2025 propagates disinformation about reproductive health care. And it does so both through these direct policies, but as well as using personhood ideology and the extreme belief that life begins at conception, spouting disinformation as facts and promoting harmful and outdated stereotypes. One thing that I think that has been named previously, but I wanted to reiterate is that Project 2025 really
Yvonne, please slow down for the interpreters.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I speak very fast. My apologies.
Everyone does. Go for it.
Well, that this document idealizes and promotes policies that facilitate extremist goals of establishing what's really a dystopian, misogynistic, heteronormative, and homophobic view of what societies and families should be. Namely, a place where people are bound by outdated gender stereotypes, where women's freedoms are repressed, and where an extreme ideology dictates everyday life for all. This mandate, if permitted to take effect, would particularly devastate reproductive freedom, and I'll highlight some of those key examples. It willfully misinterprets and misuses the antiquated Comstock Act to block access to both abortion pills and medical equipment used for abortion care. This would effectively ban abortion in all 50 states, with or without the support of Congress and the courts. So, meaning they don't need a national abortion ban. I know we've heard a lot about whether or not one will be signed. Here is proof that they actually don't need it because they misuse and misapply Comstock to rescind, or they will, to rescind Food and Drug Administration approvals, to launch criminal investigations and prosecutions against those who ship medication abortion and medical instruments used in abortion care, or in the interim, advocates for reinstating medically unnecessary restrictions on mifepristone to severely undermine access to medication abortion. Secondly, it includes language and policies that propagate the belief that life begins at conception, as I've mentioned. This so-called personhood language could ban not only abortion, but also some forms of birth control and assisted fertility treatments like IVF. Project 2025 utilizes personhood ideology throughout the document. For example, it advocates for the National Institutes of Health Research to, quote, ensure that abortion and embryo destructive related research, cell lines, and other testing methods become both fully obsolete and ethically unthinkable, end quote. Third, it calls for the administration to stop enforcing a federal law requiring that hospitals provide emergency care for pregnant people who need an abortion. This would force countless more people, because we've already seen it, to endure the tragic and life-threatening situations and the horror stories that, again, we've heard about. Project 2025 proposes ordering executive agencies to cease investigating and enforcing federal requirements under the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act against hospitals that refuse to provide emergency abortion care. I know that I have this visual in my head of women being airlifted in helicopters away from hospitals that very well could have provided them the care that they needed, the life-saving care that they needed, but they were forced to leave the state. Project 2025 also advocates for restoring exceptions that would allow individuals and institutions to deny patients reproductive care. That's not just in states, again, where bans are in place. That is everywhere. And one that is particularly scary, not that all of the rest aren't, but it goes as far to track pregnancy outcomes, including abortion, across the country. So Project 2025 outlines plans to have the federal government broadly track pregnancy outcomes, including births and abortions, and withdraw a rule in place by the Biden-Harris administration to actually strengthen HIPAA protections for patients accessing reproductive health care. So these are hardly the only efforts to block access to reproductive health care and trample our reproductive freedom in Project 2025. From deleting the word abortion from every federal rule, agency regulation, contract, grant regulation, and piece of legislation that exists, to funding fake health centers, to inserting anti-abortion disinformation into federal health policy, there is nothing they won't be willing to try. And I think it's important for us to remember that Project 2025 isn't a thought exercise. This is truly a blueprint created by some of the most trusted administration officials and allies from Trump's administration who authored this, and I know that that has been named previously, but they played such a significant and key role as the architects of drafting this, including Roger Servino, who played a key role in blocking reproductive freedom as the director of HHS Office of Civil Rights during the Trump administration. He wrote the chapter outlining ways for the agency to further decimate abortion rights and access. And anti-abortion groups, I won't even go through the name of them, it will take too much time, but all of them have advised and supported this plan. Alliance Defending Freedom, the legal group that helped Trump end Roe v. Wade and argued the 2 abortion cases heard by the Supreme Court this term, were also advisors on Project 2025. So I can't reiterate again, just the urgent and dire threat to reproductive freedom and our democracy itself that Project 2025 poses. Providing a new administration, a second Trump administration, with even more opportunities to build on the damage that they wrought on reproductive health care, including abortion. We've already seen what life is like for women and pregnant people in the 22 states that have eliminated or restricted abortions. These bans devastate access to reproductive care across the country. So further work to end access will cripple our medical providers even further. And really, and I know that this was mentioned earlier, a question from one of the members of the press around Trump distancing himself from 2025. He knows that the vast majority of Americans support access to abortion and reproductive freedom. 8 in 10 Americans do so, and that is why we have to take Project 2025 as a very serious threat and need to make sure that folks are aware of what is possible. I want to name one experience that I just had this week, speaking with a physician in Miami who was treating a patient who shortly after learning that her cancer had returned, learned that she was pregnant and needed chemotherapy treatment right away and therefore needed an abortion. There was no provider in the state of Florida who would be able to provide this for her because she was just over the 6-week mark. Already feeling ill herself and needing care and not being able to get a doctor in the state to sign off, she had to leave the state. These are real circumstances. These are real people. These are real families. These are our sisters there, our aunts there. These are people that we know and love, and they are experiencing this every day, and it will only get worse if Project 2025 goes into effect. Thank you.
Thank you, Yvonne. It always brings it home when you hear about specific cases like that. What do you think, knowing this plan as you do, what do you think would be the first thing that, if this is the winning formula in the elections, what do you think is the first thing that they will do in this area?
A lot of what we've seen before, I think, especially as it relates to any aid or any support and attacking, as we all know, those that are most vulnerable and poor are likely the ones to get the grunt immediately. And therefore, we will see further attacks on states that allow protections for or funding for access to abortion. That we will see further limits, I would say, in states that have those limits, that any protection that the federal government or that a federal administration would have provided under federal law would be rescinded. So it would really be, and I just really kind of think about this as kind of almost unplugging, right? Like any access or any support that you might have had through the federal government or a federal administration that actually supports access to abortion, those would be limited and would be cut. And I want to reiterate that the administration does not need a federal abortion ban in order to further decimate access. They can do that very well on their own, including through executive action.
What about other things like limiting contraception? Do you feel that's good? Do you think that's going to happen?
Absolutely. I feel like the Department of Health and Human Services will definitely have that within their purview. to be able to limit access, and a lot of the definitions and defining around contraception that exist in statute and law now that can quickly be essentially changed through federal agencies and administrations. And I do think too the IVF question almost really felt like an Alabama problem, that's something that happens to folks who live in those states. And it is not, because it can very well be applied across the country through their definitions, right? If they're trying to define, and if life begins at contraception and they're limiting studies and they're limiting access to what can be done, it really is at their fingertips with their pen. And being able to change, and that is the power that is wielded by an administration that is completely opposed to access to contraception, allowing families to have IVF and other services, and as well as access to abortion, including life-saving. One thing I want to reiterate is, with these bans, and they talk a lot about exceptions. Exceptions don't work. Just the patient that I spoke about, the fact that she does need life-saving care. Well, she's not going to die tomorrow, so it doesn't count, right? And so, and even in instances where lives are on the line, and women have gone septic, where doctors are too afraid, physicians are too afraid to provide that care. And it becomes too late, or patients are afraid to seek care. I think that's another thing that we have to remember. It's not just what's in place or the laws. So many women are afraid to seek care. And we saw that with the women in Georgia. And so it is a psychological effect as well, and information and lack of information that a lot of families will have about what access is available, what is legal and what is not. I think about a lot of immigrant families who fear getting care in these instances because of fear of deportation. That will be multiplied if Project 2025 were in effect.
Thank you, Yvonne, so much for your presentation. I'm going to move on to our last speaker, and that is Tony Hohen, Executive Director of Equality California. Tony.
Thank you for having me. I think a lot of folks already spoke about sort of the wide-reaching breadth of what Project 2025 would touch, and specifically honing in on the effects for the LGBTQ plus community. This project really demonstrates exactly what 4 years of a Trump-Vance administration would look like: a wrecking ball at many of the foundations of civil rights, LGBTQ plus rights, healthcare access, voting rights, and environmental protections. My colleague before just said, nearly 140 staffers in the Trump administration helped put this together, folks that have really held their careers on attacking LGBTQ plus people, folks like Roger Severino. The Heritage Foundation specifically has long fought LGBTQ plus equality by launching multi-million-dollar campaigns attacking things like marriage equality, conversion therapy, military service, parenting, inclusion in the Boy Scouts, healthcare for trans youth, LGBTQ plus in curriculum. And so we really know where these folks are coming from. And the partner organizations on the advisory board for Project 2025 include groups like Alliance Defending Freedom, American Family Association, Moms for Liberty, Family Research Council. And so you really get a sense of the far right organizations that have come together to think about how do we attack the most vulnerable in America. How this impacts specifically LGBTQ folks, I think the number one issue that they're talking about is really around transgender people. Project 2025 equates the act of being transgender or transgender ideology to pornography and declares that it should be outlawed. It aims
Tony,
to
please slow down for the interpreters. Sorry.
Thank you. No, like Yvonne, I speak quite fast as well. What Project 2025 would do is cut federal funding for gender-affirming care, not just for children, but for adults, which is in line with Trump's own policy proposals. At the DOJ, Project 2025 suggests revisiting Biden's administration's assertion that trans minors have the right to gender-affirming care and allows healthcare workers to opt out of providing such care if they say they object to it for religious reasons. The plan's authors describe gender-affirming care for youth as social contagion that especially affects young girls, writing, "The next administration should take particular note of how radical gender ideologies is having a devastating effect on school-age children today. They would revoke Medicare and Medi-Cal funding if they provide gender-affirming care to trans people as a whole." And like Yvonne said earlier, they'll touch reproductive freedom and replace the Department of Health and Human Services with something like what they call the Department of Life. Not just removing access to abortion care, but having this new agency take up the official stance that families are made up of a married father and mother and children, and to redirect federal funds to support a biblically based definition of family. They would cut Title X funding. And why this matters specifically for LGBTQ people is that many of these clinics are a key source of reproductive health care for LGBTQ plus people like Planned Parenthood. And when we're talking about the most vulnerable, we're talking about LGBTQ plus youth. Things like closing the Department of Education, ordering that no school employee should be forced to use a student's chosen pronoun, advancing a federal quote unquote parental bill of rights to restore parental rights around a student's decision to transition. They would bring lawsuits against school districts or withheld federal funding if school officials affirm transgender students' gender identity by acknowledging the existence of trans people in their schools and are allowing them to use the restrooms that accord with their gender identity. And it doesn't just go around LGBTQ plus youth. There was a landmark decision by the Supreme Court recently called Bostock that expanded the scope of sex discrimination and federal non-discrimination protections to include the employment. What they would do is want to reverse those policies from the Biden administration and turn back time and allow folks to discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity in the workplace. And it doesn't just talk about LGBTQ plus youth, healthcare, or employment. It's also in the military and foreign policy. What Project 2025 would do was reverse policies allowing transgender people to serve in the military, expelling them from things where they want to serve their country, expelling people living with HIV in the military, and ending the Department of State's LGBTQ plus equality initiatives to end violence against our community where same-sex conduct remains punishable by death. And this is not just in a vacuum. Obviously, there's been a rise in hate crimes, not just in California, but across the country. Year after year, hate crimes against LGBTQ people have increased. Just 2 weeks ago in California, there was an incident where a high school student was assaulted in a place where we call Chino Valley. This is the same school district that has been pushing anti-LGBTQ plus policies. And this is a proof point where rhetoric turns into actual hurt against our community. And it's not just against LGBTQ people, it's against our allies. There was a well-known incident last year in Lake Arrowhead where Lori Carlton, an ally who had a pride flag, was shot to death because she had a pride flag in front of her store. And so the rhetoric that is happening from Project 2025 is having clear impacts in terms of hate crimes against the LGBTQ plus community. So with that, I'll turn it back to Pilar.
Wow, thank you, Tony. This is all pretty overwhelming. So there's a bunch of questions in the chat that we haven't had time to get to, but one of our regulars, Henrietta Burrows, had a really good question about that could be answered by all of you. Henrietta, you want to ask it?
Yes, thanks so much, Pilar. We've heard now about all of the dangers if Project 2025 is implemented. What can we do now? What can we do to address all of these issues to try to make sure it's not implemented? And if it is implemented, what other steps can we take to fight it?
Well, I have to say, the first thing that comes to mind is that this is a nonpartisan event. We know that the voters have this in their hands. But beyond that, what do you all suggest? What if it actually comes to pass that this is what we're facing? What can we, ethnic media, what can we citizens do in the face of this kind of agenda? Manju,
If it's
maybe?
okay, yeah, I'm happy to start. Well, before it gets implemented, I mean, and the reason, you know, I really want to thank Sandy, Pilar, Sunitha, and others for hosting this, because, you know, as Salma said in her remarks, so many of our community members still don't know about it. It has not been described or discussed in ethnic media where so many of our community members get their news. So first and foremost, please write about it. Inform your readers. That is critical, that they are well informed when they go to the ballot box or they mail in their ballot. Secondly, if and when we get to that time of implementation, it is critical that the media tell the stories of our community members. It was so important for us when family separation happened, when the Muslim ban happened, to hear of individual community members and the impacts on them, to humanize them, to humanize us, frankly, right? When policies like this and racist rhetoric is out there, the first goal of it is to dehumanize people like us that are on this call. And so the first thing I implore you to do is to humanize us. And I'm sad that I have to actually ask that happen. Number two is for advocates. So many of us are preparing for, you know, action on local, state, and federal levels. And we were activated under the prior administration. We continue to be active even against policies of the Biden administration, right? Making sure that LAPD does not, for example, work with ICE in Los Angeles, making sure that our governor and our legislature are there to protect immigrants in California, making sure those of our folks in Congress know and fight back. And they did so many times then, and they fought for things like voting rights, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, for reproductive freedoms, and really undoing what the Supreme Court did in terms of the dismantling of Roe v. Wade. And that all will happen again. And we are getting ready. And lastly, I think individuals, it's in our hands, whether you're a US citizen or not, to protest, to call elected officials, to make your voice heard, so that people know that we won't stand for this. And this really doesn't reflect our values as a nation.
Anyone else would like to say
I
something?
mean, I do want to add to that, because, and I think you're absolutely right. The calls, I am talking on the phone to people in North Carolina on Wednesday nights, and a lot of these people are, you know, from all parties, blue, white, red, and Republican and Democrats, and everybody. I think everybody, like we talk to people begin to see something like this horrible being enacted. I still want to believe, and I still believe that most human beings, most Americans will not want to stand for that. And so I think knowing, seeing, like, for media to play a big role, for all of us to continue to do what we're trying to do, which is to like talk about it, talk to people, and give the information. Like I said, until a month ago, this was, until 6 months ago, this was not even available in Spanish, and now it is. So we are doing what we can now to let people know what's in there. But I think even I believe that people coming together can still solve some of these problems. And I think the majority of Americans, if they see what's on there, would be against it.
Thank you. Anyone else? We actually have a good question, and I just posted an article. Raymond was asking, will the press be sanctioned and punished under 2025? And yes, there is a section about media, about restricting media, about restricting journalists' access to the White House, about making it easier to get journalists' data and phone numbers, and things like that. I just posted that article there. So yes, the media is also included in Project 2025. I just wanted to go to there is an intriguing question again from Don. What is the ultimate goal here? Of all of these things, it's you think about it and you go, why would these people these folks that want to work for the government, in the government, want to do all of these things that would, I think, bring us back many years in terms of rights in the United States. Why? Anyone has an answer to that?
I do. Oh, please go ahead, Tony.
No, I think somebody said it earlier. Just this just dystopian worldview, right? It's Christian nationalism, sort of in a 900-page document, a roadmap of where they want to roll back time with a specific identity where they want all Americans to follow. And obviously, we know, the folks in this call specifically with the outlets here, that we are a wide, diverse group that make up what America is. And they're really wanting to roll back the clock specifically in their one world view. And that's the end of the day what they're trying to get at.
Yeah, and we come at this from, like, there is behind this corporate greed, like the inequality and the greed for more profit is driving a lot of this conversation. So that is, I think that's also what's behind this. If you look at, we're going back to the conversation about, the growing inequality in this country and who really gets to control that. And a lot of what's behind it is driven by the greed of billionaires and corporations.
And I'll just add quickly, I mean, this ultimately is about power. So many folks see demographic changes, they see women in the workplace, and they don't like it because they had a monopoly on power in America. And unfortunately, because of the Electoral College, because of the Senate, we don't have the democracy that we should in the US. And so where they had sole power or primary power, they have been losing it because of some of those demographic shifts. And so where you can't do it in a true democracy, and you can't do it when it's unpopular, you can do it by executive action, and you can do it by taking away the rights of individuals, so they don't feel empowered and they essentially can't thrive. And that's why it's so critical that each and every one of us stand up, not only, and by the way, not only for ourselves, but for our friends and family members. So, you may not be LGBTQ, but you can stand up for family members and friends. You may not be a woman or of reproductive age, but you can stand up for your sisters and daughters. And you may not be an immigrant or a person of color, but you can stand up. I mean, and that's what I think we are trying to share today, is that it's going to take all of us to fight this now and in the future.
One thing I just wanted to add to that, in the vein of control, like, this is the control of our every movements, and it has been happening, like voting rights, gerrymandering, like the way that they draw these insane districts to really oppress voices and suppress voices, and to make sure that we cannot be counted and represented. And they do it by design, and they do it when we're not paying attention. I think it was said earlier, it is good that they have actually put this out, of like, thank you so much for the outline of how you will further, attack us. But at the same time, I think that, this is a continuation of a playbook that they have already started, and that they have already very well waged their assault into. And this is the continuation, and this is where it needs to be. So we have the opportunity to stop it now.
All right, we come to the end of this briefing. It's with 1 minute left. Thank you so much for all this information. I think there's many more topics that could be covered that are in this document. Somebody was asking just now about police and how the police can exercise abuse, etc. But it's up to us journalists to go into this document, to go in and talk to other organizations that are, in different areas of our lives, and ask them, and kind of cover all the other issues that are there. This is just a taste of what it is. But Sandy, you want to say something before we go? Sandy Close, our founder and director.
Yes, I'm here. We've heard this remarkable document is a manifesto. And it's fascinating to see these long-standing goals that are now all together in a single document that I do believe have been inspired by the fear of replacement, that America is being the America that the authors represent is being replaced by a different America, an America of inclusion, diversity, and equity, and they want to stop it, full stop. And it is a remarkable document that we need to take seriously as an intellectual formulation that we've rarely seen. I can't remember seeing such clarity over 900 pages setting forth this manifesto. So I thank our speakers for helping alert us to what is really what could be a seminal document in understanding the stakes for the Heritage Foundation and its backers in setting forth this document of Project 2025. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good weekend.